Hello and welcome to Dev Summit 2021. My name is Nimesh Charicha and I am a developer on ArcGIS Runtime SDK for iOS team. And I'll be joined later by my colleagues Kaushik Hajra and Zooming Wu. They work on ArcGIS Runtime SDK for Qt and ArcGIS Runtime SDK for Android respectively. Today we are going to talk about authenticating your apps with the ArcGIS system using ArcGIS Runtime SDKs. We will focus on the common workflows and patterns to work with authentication. We will also talk about some of the platform-specific APIs provided by some of the SDKs. The purpose is to familiarize you with the various authentication methods used in ArcGIS system and how to handle them in your runtime applications. We will go through when is authentication required, goals of runtime authentication APIs, process of authenticating a user, and some of the details of Authentication Manager, Authentication Challenge, and Credential Cache. We will also talk about accessing ArcGIS platform services using API key, which we introduced recently. Let's look into when is authentication required. First, what is authentication? Authentication is the process of recognizing or verifying a user's identity. Now, when is authentication required? Authentication is required when you access a user's secure or private layer services or resources, or when your app wants to edit a user's data and push those changes to the server or portal, or when app access ArcGIS platform services like routing or geocoding, etc. The ArcGIS system supports different authentication methods like OAuth 2.0, ArcGIS token, client certificate, or public key infrastructure known as PKI. Different type of HTTP methods like integrated Windows authentication, basic, or digest. We looked at what is authentication, when is it required, and supported authentication methods by ArcGIS system. Now let's look into the goals of runtime authentication APIs. Security is complicated and requires a lot of work. So the goals of runtime authentication APIs are such that you as an app developer have to write less security code and focus more on your app's business logic. We have centralized logic to handle security configurations and operations to avoid multiple failure points. You write security code once and at one place to handle all different authentication methods. We have common patterns to deal with security in different runtime SDKs. So you can deal with auth security in different platforms like Android, Java, iOS, Qt, and .NET SDKs similar way. We have security and authentication guide doc available for all SDKs. We looked at the goals of runtime authentication APIs. Here is the high-level common design diagram of runtime authentication APIs. This includes Authentication Manager, Authentication Challenge type, Credential Cache, and OAuth configuration. Please note that all runtime SDKs have common security patterns, but APIs themselves differ slightly on each of them. Now let's look into what is involved in authenticating a user. When you try to access any secured layer from your app, the request is sent to the server or a portal. It fails with an authentication error. The error is detected, the Authentication Manager comes into action. The authentication challenge is created and its type is determined based on the error and provided configuration on the Authentication Manager. The challenge is presented to the user. When user provides credentials, request is sent back to the server. Server validates the identity of the user and sends the response and to load the layer or a service. So this was the process of authenticating a user. Now let's look into the Authentication Manager. Authentication Manager is the central component of runtime authentication APIs. It is a singleton, so there is only one instance available for the session. It is a go-to class for all security code handling in your app. On it, you can provide OAuth configuration and certificates upfront for us to use it when come across authentication errors. It provides APIs to handle different type of authentication challenges. If you're using server, which is in development environment, and using the self-signed certificate, then you can manage its trust as well. You can access the credential cache, and some runtime SDKs like Qt and .NET provides ability to add or remove credential to it. This was some of the information about Authentication Manager. Again, please note that all runtime SDKs have common security patterns, but APIs themselves differ slightly on each of them. Now let's look into Authentication Challenge. Authentication challenge is created when you send requests and server demands with one or more credentials. It will have information like error, requests which caused the challenge, proposed credential, failure count, etc. It allows multiple attempts for you to provide the valid credential. For example, if you type incorrect username or password, then it will prompt it again. The Runtime iOS SDK allows 5 attempts before failing the request with an error. If you want to control whether to issue authentication challenge for any particular resource, then you can set the property on request configuration of that resource. There are different types of authentication challenges like username password. If you are accessing any HTTP secured layer or portal, then the authentication challenge type will be username password. OAuth, when you try to log into a portal, and if it supports the OAuth, then the challenge type will be OAuth. Client certificate. If you are trying to access PKI secured layer or portal, the challenge will be of type client certificate. Untrusted host. If you are trying to access server in a development environment with self-signed certificate, then the challenge will be of type untrusted host. Actions you can take on authentication challenge. Continue with credentials. If you know the credential or you get it from the end user, then you can create the credential object and fulfill challenge with it. If the challenge type is untrusted host, then you can take action like trust host and continue. Or you can decide to cancel the challenge. In this case, the request will fail with user cancelled error. Handlers. There are two options here, default or custom. Default is where SDK handles the challenge and provide appropriate user interface to end user. Custom is where the developer wants to handle the challenge and provide their own user interface to end user. We will look at them in detail soon. This was some of the information about authentication challenge. Again, please note that all runtime SDKs have common security patterns, but APIs themselves slightly differ on each of them. Now let's look at the authentication challenge handlers, and first one is default authentication challenge handler. Default challenge handler is where SDK is presenting user interface to the end user to handle authentication challenge based on its type. Not all SDKs have default challenge handler functionality. For iOS, it is a default option. So as a developer, you don't need to do anything for presenting a user interface to handle challenge. For Java and Android, it's opt-in. You will have to create the instance of a default challenge handler and set it on Authentication Manager. For Qt and .NET SDK, there is no inbuilt component. So they provide challenge handler components in toolkit or sample. So custom challenge handler is the only option for them. Let's look at default authentication challenge handler in action for iOS. This is the demo for default authentication challenge handler. This app has 4 buttons to demonstrate different authentication challenge type handling. Let's tap on the untrusted host button first. So it alerts that it cannot verify the identity of particular host. The server certificate is invalid and whether you want to continue or not. So let's cancel it for now and look at the code. So this is the code which is being hit by that button. It tries to create the service feature table with URL and then it tries to load the service feature table. So when service feature table tries to load it, it detects that this particular host certificate is untrusted or the self-signed certificate is there. So it prompts you with the alert. So you can look at that. There is no security code to handle the challenge, but it still prompts you. Now let's look at the next challenge type called client certificate. So when I tap on it, it says that particular host requires a client certificate and would you like to browse for the certificate to connect to the host. If I click on the browse, it opens a view controller to browse to allow me to browse the certificate anywhere on my device or on iCloud Drive. If there are external drive applications installed on this device, then those are also getting listed there. So that can allow you to pick your certificate wherever you have cap, and then you can load the resource. Now let's cancel the challenge and look at the code. So this is the code which prompts for the client certificate, and if you look at the code, a portal URL is created for this particular URL, and then portal is created with that URL, and portal is trying to load. When portal tries to load, it detects that this particular host is set up with the client certificate security, and it prompts you to browse for the certificate on your device. And that's it. Now let's look at the next challenge type called username password. And I tap on the username password button, it prompts me to enter the username password. I can either enter valid username and password and click sign in, or I can skip it. So let's skip it for now and look at the code. So this is the code for username and password challenge, and if you look at it, this portal URL is created. Then portal is created with this portal URL, and it tries to load the portal. When it tries to load the portal, it detects that this particular host is using the integrated Windows authentication security, and it prompts to enter the username and password. Now let's look at the last authentication challenge type called auth. If I tap on it, it displays the auth login view controller for me to enter the username and password. Let's cancel it for now and look at the code. So the portal URL is created on ArcGIS.com. Then OAuth configuration is created with that portal URL, client ID, and redirect URL. Then that OAuth configuration is added to the Authentication Manager's OAuth configurations property. And then portal is created with portal URL, and it tries to load the portal. When it tries to load the portal, it detects that ArcGIS.com supports OAuth, and OAuth configuration is available on Authentication Manager. And that's how it detects that, sets the authentication challenge type to OAuth and displays the OAuth view. So this was all the default authentication challenge handler demo. Let's get back to slide. So we looked at the default authentication challenge handler demo, and now Kaushik will talk about custom authentication challenge handler.
Thank you, Nimesh, and hello everyone. Nimesh just showed you how the default challenge handler works in iOS. I'm going to talk about the custom authentication challenge handler and how it works in the Qt SDK. So what is a custom challenge handler? Well, most runtime SDKs provide a challenge handler that's out of the box, which is what Nimesh just showed you. However, as a user, you might not like the look and feel of the handler, or there might be a case where the theme of the default handler does not quite match the theme of your application. That's when you would need a custom challenge handler where you can modify the look and feel according to your needs. In Qt SDK, what we've done is we've open sourced the entire challenge handling mechanism via a toolkit item. I will show you in a minute where you can find the repo that hosts the toolkit. All you would need is to clone the repo, include the toolkit in your project, import the toolkit, and then add the authentication view component, and you get a handler out of the box. We have done all the internal plumbing for it to work seamlessly for you. The handler itself is a QML element, and you can change it however you would like. Now, let me quickly show you how all of these things work in a small demo. So as I mentioned in the slides, the first thing you need to work with the Qt's challenge handler is the open source toolkit. So where do you find the open source toolkit? So if you go to github.com, sign in with your username and password, look for the Esri organization, and then search for the ArcGIS Runtime Toolkit Qt repo. Once you get to the repo, all you have to do is just clone it. Once you clone it, you get the entire repository on disk. So I have already done it, and I'm going to show you how to get it to work. So I have cloned the repo on my disk and I know exactly where it is. So the first step is to include that repository, basically the toolkit, into your project. So here's my project file, and this is how I have included it. So I know where my toolkit is, so just use my relative pathing to include the toolkit in my project. So once I've done that, the next thing I need to do is import it in the QML file where I want to display the authentication dialog. So here's my QML file, and I'm importing the right version of the toolkit here. So I'm using 100.10, which is the latest release version. So that's what I'm using. That's the version I'm using. So once I'm done importing it, then all I have to do is declare an authentication view component. So here is the toolkit on disk, and once I've imported, you can see all the different components that the toolkit has. The one I need is the authentication view, because that's where the dialog is defined. So once I've done all of that, let me build and run to show you how it works. So once I build and run, I get this application, and if I click on load secure layer, I get a simple dialog to enter a username and password. So this is what you get out of the box. Now, let's say this doesn't fit with my application's theme, or I don't like the look and feel or whatever. I want to change it. I want to change the username. What I'm going to do here is I want to change the background of this text field where the username appears. So I'm going to change it to a silver color. So let me close this. Go back to my code. So what was the view that the component name? It was authentication view. So I'm going to find that view in the toolkit. And once you go there, what you'll see is there's different components that are declared, one for each authentication type. So this is the user credential view where you enter username and password. That's the one I just showed you. Here's the OAuth view. Now you don't need to worry about which view to declare in which case, because we have already handled all the plumbing internally. So I want to change the user credential view. So if I right click and follow symbol under cursor, it takes me right to the dialog. And this is all open source, and you can see how all of this is laid out. You can see it in the GitHub repository. And what I want to change is the text field where the username is declared. So I've added that snippet for the sake of time. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to uncomment it. So all I'm doing is adding a little background, adding a rectangle component, and giving it a color silver, because that's what I wanted to do. So once I've done that, let me run again, make it full screen. Now if I click on that load secure layer, you see now that the background color is silver. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. So in essence, you saw how a custom challenge handler works in Qt and how easy it was to change the look and feel. We've given you all the power since it's all open source. We hope you'll use it and find it useful. With that, I'll pass it along to Xiuming, who's going to talk about Credential Cache in runtime and how that works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kushik. Hello, everyone. You have seen that the Authentication Manager allows you to manage authentication relating operations and events, and how you can customize the UI or the logic of the change handler. Now, let's look at another feature of the Authentication Manager, Credential Cache. The Credential Cache maintains a cache of credentials in memory. It is enabled by default and contains the credentials that have been previously used to satisfy authentication challenges. This allows credentials to be reused by requests from the same security domain when it is appropriate. This prevents unnecessary or duplicate challenges from being issued and provide friendly user experience in your applications. You can access the credential cache through the Authentication Manager. You can also add credentials to the cache, update existing credentials, or remove credentials from the cache. The credential cache also allows you to invalidate OAuth refresh tokens when removing the credentials from the cache. In addition, the credential cache has the ability to be persisting so that when the app restarts, the cache is automatically pre-populating with saved credentials, and the user does not have to sign in again. With the persistence, the credential cache can be repopulating between user sections, different apps, or different devices. However, it is very crucial that the persistence is encrypting and stored to a secure storage. Our runtime SDKs provide platform-specific solution to fulfill this requirement. On Runtime for iOS SDK, the credential cache can be persisting to the keychain. Android SDK allows to store the cache in the share preference. When using .NET SDK, you can choose to persist the credential cache to a key store, keychain, or data protection depends on the platform on which your app deploys. A few runtime SDKs allow developers to persist credentials to JSON strings. Please keep in mind that it is the developer's responsibility to encrypt the JSON string if you want to save the JSON string to a file. Now I'm going to show you a demo of Credential Cache on Android. This Android sample app used the default authentication change handler to handle authentication challenges. As Nimish mentioned before, on Android, to use the default authentication change handler, you need to opt in. This is actually only one line of code. You instantiate an instance of the default authentication change handler and set it on the Authentication Manager. This sample also uses share preference to persist credentials. You create an instance of the share preference credential persistence and also set it on the credential cache through the Authentication Manager. Once a credential persistence is set on the Authentication Manager, the credential cache and the persistence, they are in sync, meaning any credential adding to the cache will be also adding to the persistence. And any credential being removed from the cache, it's also being removed from the persistence, and vice versa. So when this sample is launched, the default change handler and the shared preference credential persistence have been initialized. This sample has a few manual items. The first one is add layer. It will create a map image layer from a secure map service without passing in any credential. Check persistence will look up the credential persistence. If there's any credential is appropriate, we'll use this credential to load the same map image layer. Revoke credential. Revoke credential will invalidate and remove credentials from Credential Cache. At the same time, it also removes credential from the shared preference. Clear cache. Clear cache will remove all credentials from the credential cache without invalidating the credentials. Add credential. Add credential. Create a new user credential and add it to the shared preference. At the same time, it also adding to the credential cache. Let's check out all these manual items one by one. First, add a layer. As this layer is pointing to a secure map service, the default change handler prompts me for username and password. Once I input the correct username and password, the layer is loading. At the meantime, the credential was adding to both Credential Cache and the shared preference. To verify this, I can close the app, reopen the app again. Now, if I check the shared preference to see if there's any credential can be used to load the same map image layer. As the credential was saved to shared preference before closing the app, that credential can be reused to load the map image layer. The default change handler didn't issue any challenges. I can revoke credential from the cache and also the shared preference. To verify this, I can use the app layer as there's no credential in either the cache or the persistence. The default change handler prompts me for username and password again. Let's cancel this authentication process for now. I can create a new credential and add it to the persistence. Now, I close the app, reopen the app. As the credential was adding to the shared preference before closing the app, if I check the persistence, the layer is loading using the credential that's saved to the shared preference. If I clear credential, the credential is removed from the cache and also the persistence. To verify this, I can try the check persistence. Now the default change handler changed me for username and password as there's no credential in either the cache or the persistence. Now I'm switching back to slides to talk about offline content security. When your app supports offline workflows, it is very likely you will work with mobile map package or mobile scene package on 2D or 3D respectively. A mobile package is a standalone file that contains map or scene and data. It can be used to display maps and scenes, geocode, reverse geocode, find routes and directions, and analyze data when offline. You can sideload or download a mobile map package to your device and use it with a network connection. Currently, a mobile package is neither encrypting nor password protecting. Anyone who can get hold of the file can access your data packed in the mobile package. We are aware of the security concerns of the mobile package and will work on the issue. At the meantime, there's one thing you can do to minimize the unintended usage of your mobile package. You can control the lifetime of your mobile package by setting an expiration date on the package. This can be a hard expiry, after which runtime APIs will not open the mobile package. Similarly, for another key component of offline data, which is mobile geodatabase. Currently, there is no mechanism to secure or encrypt SQLite geodatabase for runtime. Using a SQLite browser, it is easy to read the geodatabase file, which could compromise the data. Please be aware of these concerns and protect your data. With that, I'm handing it over to Nimish to talk about API keys in Runtime SDKs.
Thank you, Kaushik and Zumi. Now let's talk about API key. What is an API key? API key is a unique identifier used to authenticate a user, developer, or calling program to an API, although most typically used to authenticate a project rather than a human user. We introduced support for accessing ArcGIS platform services using API key in our latest update 10 release. API key allows access to ArcGIS platform services like meter base maps, geocoding, and point of interest search, network services like routing, service area closest facility, and demographic services. API keys are good for applications where you do not want the user to log in. You can scope API key to specific services. It allows you to monitor usage per key. It allows restricting access to using HTTP referrer. It gives permanent access until the API key is updated or deleted. You can use it alongside your own sign-in user identity outside of ArcGIS. API keys used with an ArcGIS developer account. It provides pay-as-you-go access to ArcGIS platform services. You can access your own read-only private hosted data services. This was an overview of API key. Now let's talk about ArcGIS developer account. When you go to developers.arcgis.com, you can create a new account by going to sign in page or sign into an existing account. Once you are signed in, go to dashboard and you will see a default API key. You can start using it in your application. You can manage your API keys, including creating them, deleting them, see their usage, and what they provide access to in the developer dashboard. This was some of the information about signing into ArcGIS developer account and API keys. Now let's look into the usage of API keys in application built with Runtime SDKs. There are many runtime classes now have an API key property. You can set a global API key on the ArcGIS Runtime environment to cover your entire application, or you can get more fine-grained and set API keys on individual layers or tasks. If you need to combine named user login with API keys, then use the fine-grained properties. If you just want to use API keys for your whole app, set the API key on ArcGIS Runtime environment. There are a lot of guide doc and tutorials available on developers' website for you to learn about the Runtime SDKs. Let's do a quick demo of a tutorial display or map using ArcGIS Runtime SDK for iOS. This is the demo for display or map tutorial. To save time, I have already created Xcode project and set it up until the step set the API key. Let's go over the code, and here is the map view instance. A map view variable is created and it is linked to a map view in a storyboard. Then there is a private function called setupMap, which creates a map with a base map style called ArcGIS topographic. Then the created map is set on the map view here. Then a set viewpoint is set on the map view with a particular location and a scale. This setup map function is called here under view did load. Now let's build and run the project. And you can see that loading a map prompts to enter the credential. This is because this base map style, ArcGIS topographic, is secure. It requires either an ArcGIS identity or an API key. So let's stop this and go into the app delegate. Now I have already code to set the API key on ArcGIS Runtime environment, but it's commented. Now let me uncomment this. And please note that it is not a best practice to store API keys in source code. The API key is referenced here for the convenience of this tutorial. It is better if you set this API key in some configuration and then read it and set it here when it starts the application. We are setting this API key in the did finish launching with option, and let's build and run the project now. You can see the map now. You can zoom in, you can pan, you can interact with it. So this was the tutorial, display a map. Thank you. In summary, we went through when is authentication required, goals of runtime authentication APIs, process of authenticating a user, and some of the details of Authentication Manager, Authentication Challenge, and Credential Cache. We also talked about accessing ArcGIS platform services using API key. The purpose was to familiarize you with various authentication methods used in ArcGIS system and how to handle them in your runtime applications. Here are links of Runtime SDKs, Security and Authentication Guide Doc. Thank you. Please provide your feedback for this session by clicking on the session survey link directly below the video. Thank you. Welcome to this Runtime Sessions Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yep, welcome. So we have a few questions for this session. The first one is, where does SAML authentication fit into this? I'll ask Zooming to reply to this one.
The SAML authentication, it's actually fall into the OAuth category. From the API's perspective, which we're treating SAML the same as OAuth. So the way you work with SAML is the way you work with the regular OAuth. So basically, you need to when using the default change handler, you will need to create an OAuth configuration for your SAML portal with the portal URL, client ID, and also a redirect URI, an optional. For the redirect URI will be optional.
The second question is, I've created a runtime app with OAuth 2.0 authentication. Will it work when ArcGIS Enterprise will be reconfigured to use external SAML identity provider? I'll ask, let's go to Kaushik for this one.
Yeah, it should just work. Basically, once the enterprise has been configured with SAML, the OAuth web view should still prompt you, and you should use the same login that you're supposed to use, and it should just work.
Thank you, Kaushik. So the third one is, in case of OAuth, client ID is passed, which is configured in the portal. Do we need to configure the data source URL with the app? Is the data source URL validated anyways with the request URL? I'm not 100% sure what the data source URL is referred here, but in general, it works like you create a client ID on the portal and then register the redirect URL with that client ID, and then use that client ID and redirect URL in the client application. You create the OAuth configuration with that client ID and redirect URL, and then you try to access the portal, and those both of will be used. And when you send the request to access any particular layer, the generated token with that OAuth login will be used to access those layer URLs. And if user who used the login has access to that layer, then that will be authenticated, and you will be able to access the layers. I hope I answered your question here, but if not, if you have more details or if you have further questions, I would suggest to come to Ask Our Experts area in Runtime SDKs channel, and we can talk more about this particular thing. The next question is, what is the best practice to supply client ID if I'm supporting multiple maps? Should I create multiple apps in the portal to create a unique app ID for each map, or better to create one app and use the same client ID across multiple apps? So here, if you are accessing only one portal and different maps from the same portal, then there is no need to create multiple client IDs. You can just create one client ID and access multiple maps. From the client side, whichever user is trying to log in has access to those maps, or the layers will be able to access those. So here the recommendation is just to use one client ID for that portal, unless you have specific requirement of not using using the different client ID for any specific reasons. So this answers all of the questions. If there are any other questions, please feel free to stop by at the Ask Our Experts area, and we can help you out there. If there are any more questions, there's still time, a few minutes left. You can post the question and we can go over.
When we are waiting for more questions to come, another commonly asked question we have in the past is some user want to know if we support social logins. The answer is actually yes, we support social logins. The social login, it will work like the other regular login with the enterprise. So you just, as long as your portal or your organization supports social login like the Google account or the Facebook account or GitHub account, or even your Apple account, as long as the portal or the organization support it, our SDKs also support it.
Okay. There's another general questions we get it like what different type of tokens are there for what? Kaushik, do you want to go into that one? Yeah, I can. Otherwise, I can help you with this one. So there are generally two types of tokens. They are called for OAuth. It's called refresh token and access token. And the general validities are like for refresh token, it's 2 weeks, and the access token is 30 minutes. So every 30 minutes, we regenerate the access token using the refresh token. It looks like
yeah, so it's certain SDKs have, you can go on infinitely, right? So can you expand on it to say if it's uniform on all the SDKs in runtime?
Yeah, so there's a more detail to it. It's configurable. The refresh token can be extended by if you set the refresh token expansion interval on the OAuth configuration to -1, then that refresh token and the access tokens will keep getting renewed. And you will have unlimited login.
Right. What would be a situation where such a thing would be needed? So I know certain organizations have such kind of needs. They don't want their users to log in multiple times. So especially in field apps and things like that. So those are kind of situations where that's very useful.
Yep.
Right. But that's one thing is that to keep in mind is that your portal or your organization need to support that. So that's a configuration or setting on the portal to enable that or disable that.
That's it. Looks like there are no more questions. Thank you for joining everyone for this session. And yeah, as I suggested, if there are any more questions related to security authentication for runtime, please stop by at the Ask Our Experts channel, runtime channel.
Yep. Thank you for attending our sections. And if you have any question, yeah, as Nimesh mentioned, you can go to the Ask Expert channel, the native runtime SDK channel to ask more questions, not only relating to security, but also
anything relating to our runtime APIs, you can ask over there, or like if outside of the Dev Summit, you can always ask questions in our JONNET channels.
Yeah, thanks a lot for joining us.